Julie, I think we're ready to kick this off.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the SWIM Fall 2021 public meeting. We appreciate you being here with us today. I'm Julie Welch. I'm the program manager for the SWIM Coalition. And on your screen, you should see the agenda for today's meeting. And we're very excited to have the opportunity to talk with SWIM Coalition member Greenwood Cemetery about an innovative stormwater management plan that they're working on, as well as a conversation today with the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency and Department of Environmental Protection regarding the city's stormwater resiliency plan. So we'll have an opportunity for dialogue on both of those items, which are of importance certainly to us here at Stormwater Infrastructure Matters. And I believe we still have a few people joining us, but I will make some introductions now so that when we get to our various presentations, you'll know who's speaking. From the Greenwood Cemetery team, we have Joseph Charup, Director of Horticulture, who will join Anna Kramer, a consulting engineer, on their stormwater management plan in the conversation around that program today. And then we have from the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, the Infrastructure Program Manager, Erica Yoswiak. And from DEP, we have Alan Cohen, Managing Director of Integrated Water Management at DEP. Welcome to our guests. We appreciate you joining us today and to have this conversation around two very meaningful matters that will be part of the public discourse over certainly the next few years and into the next decade. So I'll start the meeting today with a recognition of the Stormwater Infrastructure Matters Steering Committee, who is a group of incredible professionals with full-time jobs and enormous responsibilities in New York City and around the world, who guide the mission and platform of this coalition since its founding in 2007, and who it has certainly been an enormous privilege for me to work with. And if you're not familiar with the members of the steering committee, please go to our website and take a look at each of them and the amazing work that they do as professionals. And I just want to thank them for the enormous time commitment that they make every week and every year to move the conversation forward here at SWIM Coalition regarding stormwater infrastructure matters. It's truly been a privilege and an honor to work with this team of professionals over the past 7 years. And I could take the entire meeting talking about the amazing members of the steering committee, many of whom are here with us today for this meeting, and who many of you are certainly familiar with. But take some time to look at the amazing work that they do as individuals and professionals here in New York City when you have a moment. And so thank you to the steering committee for your guidance and for all of the amazing contributions that you've made to the public dialogue and the discourse underway regarding stormwater infrastructure matters. And please give them a round of applause through the icon if you can to recognize their great work.
Julie, if I may have the floor for a minute.
Sure.
The gratitude is actually all to you, Julie, for allowing us to do the work we've been able to accomplish for the past 7 years. And I really am so deeply grateful for your putting in really more than 100%. I know you've put in many hours and didn't charge us for them. and your commitment and dedication after work hours, over the weekend. It's deeply appreciated. And I really just don't have the words to express how grateful I am. I can speak for the rest of the steering committee, I think, to really want to just publicly thank you for everything you've done to allow us to be who we are today.
Oh, thank you, Shino. It truly has been a privilege. Uh, I wake up every morning excited to dig into whatever it is that we're addressing at any moment. And it's truly been a privilege and an honor. So thank you for acknowledging that work. And there's also someone else that I'd like to acknowledge, and that is Anna Yee, who joined the Swim Coalition as a swim graduate fellow just as the pandemic was closing the city of New York down, and whose intrepid spirit has accompanied us on this journey over the last 2 years, and also made an enormous contribution to what we've been able to accomplish over the last couple of years in the midst of a pandemic, and that's Anna Yee. So yet another round of applause for another member of our team who's making an enormous contribution to our work. And certainly to all of our coalition members who steward the waterways in New York City, and our amazing intrepid spirits who each day also go out onto our shorelines to protect them and to care for our waterways. And it's an honor to be in your company, and I appreciate all of the work that everyone is doing. And certainly now here we are to talk about some incredibly meaningful work that is of utmost importance to New York City as we move forward and adapt to the circumstances that have presented themselves to us, certainly over the summer, in the form of the storms and the very sobering results of them. And so I think the work of the Swim Coalition has really been underway and has us at the ready now to have some very meaningful conversations and move many of the programs that are underway forward on an accelerated schedule now. And I think that's what we're going to really talk about in terms of the Stormwater Resiliency Plan today. So that is our opening remarks, and I just wanted to do a quick rundown of some of the topics that we're going to discuss today in the meeting. One is the fact that SWIM had an opportunity to co-author a recent article in the Living Architecture Monitor of the Green Roofs for Healthy Cities organization. Which we will put a link to in the chat box. So please keep your eye on the chat box to watch for links that we put in there for you to delve further into some of the matters that we'll only address today rather briefly. But the opportunity to co-author this article was quite timely because it is regarding the city's and the state's green infrastructure tax abatement, a green roof tax abatement program. And it's something that SWIM has been advocating for since 2007. And the article talks about the timeline of stakeholder input that has been the cornerstone of this policy. And it continues even today in the form of a working group led by Emily Maxwell at the Nature Conservancy to inform the various iterations of the Green Roof Tax Abatement Program policy. And in a recent report out of City Hall, there was a recommendation to expand the program, which we're very excited about. And that's a little bit about what the article talks about. And then we also have a blog post up on the SWIM blog about the program and some of the changes that might be taking place in it coming soon. And then two recent reports that were released, one in May, which is the Stormwater Resiliency Plan, which we'll talk a lot about today, and another one that was released in late September by the mayor's office, which is one that addresses the extreme weather impacts on New York City and a series of actions that will be underway over the next few years Both of those reports we are providing links to in the chat box so that you can delve into them and take a look at the recommendations in them. And then we'll also provide an update on some of our work on Class I and SD waters in the form of a working group that we've developed, and we'll be leading an advocacy campaign throughout the remainder of this year and into next year regarding New York City's Class I and SD waters and some actions that the state is taking that may hinder the cleanup efforts that have been underway for these waters. Talk a little bit more about later on. And of course, we have the two presentations that we're going to move into in just a minute. And then at the after the two presentations, we'll have an opportunity for members to provide updates on a few of their initiatives that they have underway. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of our efforts going forward into next year.
Julie, before you move on, if we could just ask everybody to put your name and affiliation in the chat. We're keeping track of who's in the room through the participants list, but it would be great to be able to introduce each other with organizational affiliations in the chat as well.
Thank you, Shino. Yes, please. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry I forgot to do that. And I'm sorry that we can't have individuals introduce themselves here at the meeting today, but for the sake of time and so that we can really delve into our presentations, we're not going to go around the room with everyone introducing themselves, but we will recognize everyone who is here and thank you all for taking the time to be with us. And we hope that, I think we need to expand our capacity on Zoom accounts, you know, because I think more and more people are going to be joining in the years ahead as we talk about some of these very important matters on stormwater infrastructure in New York City. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I appreciate it very much. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Joseph Chara, Director of Horticulture at Greenwood Cemetery, and Anna Kramer, Consulting Engineer, on a very innovative stormwater management plan that they are proposing for Greenwood Cemetery. And if you have not been to Greenwood Cemetery, I really recommend going out there. It is one of the most precious jewels in the crown of our urban landscape and an amazing place to visit with incredible programs. And so I welcome now Joseph and Anna in joining us to talk about the proposed stormwater management program for Greenwood Cemetery.
Hi there.
Hi, Joseph.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Julie. Let me just pull up our presentation here.
Thanks everyone for having us. And thank you for all the work that you do. It's a privilege to be here.
Thank you.
So can you see my slides or do you see the presenter view?
We see your slides.
Great. So again, as Anna said, you guys do inspiring work. We're happy to be a member and we're thrilled that we get an opportunity to discuss this project with you. I'm going to give a little background to Greenwood for those who don't know much about it, and then we'll delve into this project that has brought us here today. So without further ado, Greenwood was founded in 1838. It is 478-acre active cemetery, arboretum, and public garden space in Brooklyn, New York. It's also a National Historic Landmark. And the Historic Landmark designation really plays specific attention to the landscape, which was formed by the progression of the Laurentide ice sheet 18,000 years ago. The terminal moraine pushes the aggregate. So the cemetery, like many cemeteries in Brooklyn and Queens, are built on the moraine, largely because this area was not considered profitable for development then. So Greenwood goes from the height of the moraine and the highest elevation in Brooklyn down to the outwash in Flatbush. So Greenwood was the third of the rural cemetery movements founded in the US. The first is Mount Auburn, the second is Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, and the third is Greenwood. And the rural cemetery movement was a trend in landscape architecture that began when city planners began to be concerned about overcrowding in graveyards or cemeteries that were located in the back of churches. And the thinking was that cemeteries should be located on the outskirts of cities, close enough that they could be visited, but not too close. And sort of what they ultimately became was a counterpoint to the industrialization that was going on at the time period. They institutionalized what we think of as sort of a quintessential American value, that all Americans, even those heathens who choose to live in our cities, should have access to green space. These were protected green spaces in perpetuity that were visited to relax, to take boat rides, to have picnics. And so the landscape's evolution predates all of botanic gardens, arboreta, and public park systems in this country. These were the original green spaces here. And now, when the cemetery was first surveyed, it was considered close enough for a day trip from Manhattan, but far enough away that it would never get developed. And although you can't see it on this image here, the Jackie Gleason bus terminal that sort of resembles Guantanamo Bay on one side of the cemetery and the Con Edison plant on the other, the cemetery surroundings have become anything but undeveloped. But as a result, our relative ecological value has skyrocketed. And so now as we look at this landscape and we begin to think about it in terms of the ecosystem services it provides, we're not only sort of thinking about the necessity of continuing to diversify our tree canopy. You know, we have 8,000 trees, some 600 plus species representing 90 or so genera. But we're also thinking about what activities we do that detract from the ecosystem services. We know that we have to figure out a better strategy for managing the turf grass that is our most predominant vegetation here at Greenwood, and with more ecological sensibility than simply mowing every 15 times a year the entire landscape. And so we've begun to make efforts with Cornell to look at the effects of climate change on managing an urban grassland such as Greenwood. And part of this is because we recognize that for Sunset Park, which has the least amount of access to green space per capita, we can be a green space. Now that sort of doesn't begin to overlook the potential cultural impediments to those visitors who might view, accessing a cemetery as a green space is being a bridge too far. But we do realize that our annual visitation in 2020 went from 250,000 to 600,000 in 1 year in light of the pandemic. We provided a green space in which social distancing was acceptable and passive recreation was encouraged. So we feel like now we have to look at other resources that this landscape can provide and other opportunities for us to sort of reckon with the ecosystem services that the landscape should provide and how we can potentially augment those to enhance what we offer to the community which we serve. And one of those is stormwater. We have two glacial ponds remaining and 2 retention ponds. So this is the banks of our largest water body, and this is the water body that exits into the combined sewer system. It's called Sylvan Water. It's about 1.5 acres. And this is a photo, and this is also a photo. This is an Opti System, which we've installed on the weir that exits to the combined sewer system here. So we're monitoring the outflow of the water body. So I present these photos as before pictures, and I'm going to preface the after pictures by saying we largely escaped Ida with minimal damage, but we were able to experience the potential for cataclysmic flooding as a result. So the water extended about 35 feet up from its normal point. Here's that weir again. And it was under about 2 feet of water. The waters ended up receding, but we saw flooding in most of our water bodies. Now, our buildings had minimal flooding, basements were flooded, nothing destructive as was experienced throughout wide swaths of the city, especially in low-income areas. But we saw, again, the need to manage our stormwater with more sensibility towards how it could potentially impact the community, because we know as this stormwater mounts, its impact and pressure that it puts on the combined sewer system is immense. And we know that the Owl's Head sewer shed serves about 30,000 people. And if we can figure out a better way to manage the stormwater before it hits Sylvan Water, we feel like it's an act of stewardship that might not benefit the cemetery for, let's say, 100 years, but it it doesn't matter. We're not thinking of the activities that we're undertaking now solely through the lens of its benefit to the cemetery. Because we recognize our role as a largest private landowner in New York City, we recognize the fact that some of our activities will just have to be about for the greater good. And it's not an element of being quixotic, it's more of an understanding of the fact that if we don't do anything with the amount of landscape that we have to mitigate the damages of climate change on an urban environment, we feel it's an act of negligence. So we have this great resource and we want to figure out a better way to manage it. And that's what sort of led us to begin a partnership originally with Sherwood Design Engineers to create a stormwater master plan, finding opportunities for ways to manage stormwater on site, because as far as our hydrology goes, this map from 1876 was one of our documents that we looked for as our drainage map. Now, just to put a caveat on that, we had done a cultural landscape report, which included a complete hydrology analysis from AKRF. But what came out of that was largely the stormwater system here is troubled, and existing management structures were not sufficient. So we wanted to create a new path forward, and that's led us to turn to Sherwood and ultimately to work independently with Anna Kramer, who I'll turn it over to now. And that's that.
Thanks, Joe. If actually we could go back just to the 1876 plan, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, since we have a bunch of stormwater nerds on the call. So in order to figure out what to do with the site, we needed to understand the current, the historical, and the future drainage patterns, and current issues and issues on the site, drainage issues. So this map from 1876 provided us with a lot of really interesting information, which it's hard a little bit to get oriented with this map, but the north, or the top part of the map, is the southern area of the cemetery. And the drainage pattern in this area is cesspools. So in 1876, cesspools or wet wells were designed to overflow into the sewer system once they became too full. And in the north part of the cemetery, on the bottom half of the screen in pink, you see catch basins flowing into pipes, flowing into the water bodies that Joe just talked about. There were previously 6 water bodies, and some were filled in recently. So that was also very interesting to learn. And now there are 4 water bodies. So this, coupled with talking with the cemetery, figuring out the history of, of water at Greenwood, allowed us to figure out sort of where to target our efforts. And we can go just to the next slide to show this is like the current water patterns. So we looked at historic drainage patterns, and then I ran this analysis to figure out sort of where water is currently flowing. And this is just based on elevation. So this is based on where the existing sewer connections are, as well as the topography of the site. And these 4 main areas that you see in green are the major sewer sheds on the site. In talking with the cemetery, we found that most of the current drainage issues, erosion, flooding, etc., occur on the north side, so on the left side of the screen. And so that's sort of where we decided to focus our efforts. This area is 110 acres. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So this area is 110 acres, and here it's divided into an area. The blue area at the top is the area that flows into Sylvan Water, and then the area at the bottom is sort of the excess that just discharges directly into the sewer at 4th Avenue. And this also, yeah, this is also an analysis of impervious area. So we figured out what the total area is, impervious area, and use the New York State Stormwater Design Manual to figure out what kind of areas for different solutions that we needed. And yeah, we can go to the next slide, which shows our various solutions that we came up with. We discussed several solutions and ultimately decided on a combination of those things to create sort of this integrated stormwater management solution to cover this area, which is the full area that you see here is 145 acres. And the area in blue is 110 acres. So we have 110 acres that it's being managed by the Opti System, which Joe previously discussed. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Opti System for those who haven't heard of Opti, because it's a very cool company, cool product that they make, which is that they install an active valve on a water body so that in the event, and it's coupled with a weather station. So in the event of a storm, water can be discharged out of the system ahead of the storm to create additional volume in the water body during the storm event.
And Anna, sorry to interrupt. We're pursuing additional funding sources for that Opti system. What this grant that we applied for with the Environmental Facilities Corp of New York State only addressed the bioretention basins and the water reuse system that Anna will discuss now. So.
Right. So, and the great thing also about the Opti system, it's a very small footprint. It's really just a valve that goes on the outlet of some kind of water body. So that was certainly recommended for this site where, you know, in a cemetery, you're limited quite a bit by land area, because a lot of the land area that you see here is grave sites and narrow walkways where there's not a lot of interventions that can be done. So the Opti system is a great sort of way to address some of the issues that arise during large storm events. So the Opti system is proposed, and that is coupled with a water reuse system. So a pump is proposed to be installed right at that outlet so that during dry weather days, water can be siphoned off of Sylvan water through a filter and be pumped into tanker trucks that the cemetery has. And during dry weather, you can use that water for irrigation across the site. Sylvan Water is such a large water body that you don't need to worry too much about taking out too much water. And so this provides additional, volume to be taken out of the water body during large storm events as well. And sorry, I just want to talk a little bit about the bioretention areas.
I hit the wrong button. I apologize.
That's okay.
Not
and like I said, we use the New York State Stormwater Design Manual to analyze these bioretention areas to figure out what amount of area that was needed. We're using it as a reference, but not as gospel, because we're not redeveloping anything in this area, and therefore it's not required that we install this amount of bioretention area, but this is right now, these are the potential areas for bioretention based on the location of catch basins and these like small little drainage areas that I found discharging into these bioretention areas. I should note also that the maintenance yard on the left side has experienced a lot of flooding in the past. So it's the lowest point in the entire cemetery and a great opportunity for bioretention. So yeah, this is the plan as of now. We've submitted, as Joe said, to the Environmental Facilities Corporation and hoping to get funding for these two projects, and the Opti system will be funded separately.
And the
Hopefully.
bioretention basins are rain gardens?
Yeah, so it's an engineered soil that's like 2 to 4 feet deep. I guess a rain garden is a synonym, I think.
The challenge there for a historic landscape is to maintain the historic character of the landscape while instituting interventions such as rain gardens. What we hope to use those as is an opportunity for green job training, as well for the maintenance of these bioretention basins, to look towards using 10-boot technology as well to monitor them and to see their efficacy while in the field. So it's a combination of some interesting technology and then using some boots on the ground opportunities for green job development, because we're continually looking for those opportunities when it comes to the care of our landscape, and this provided one that seems sort of natural. I will add that our service yard was actually the source of our first venture into the idea of wastewater management when we sort of first approached the Environmental Facilities Corp, I think 7 years ago, and we're like, we have this idea for a wastewater recycling system that uses a it's called a carb troll, and we didn't come in with all our ducks in a row, but that was where we first started with figuring out if we could use a gray water recycling in our service yard to maintain and wash vehicles and then reuse that water. But I think we've come up with a much more cohesive science-based approach to managing the landscape rather than just sort of haphazard slapping a pad in the service yard. So that's it.
Well, thank you so much. I know that folks are going to have lots of questions for both of you, and I think we have time for a couple of them to be asked now, but please also put your questions in the chat so that we can make sure that we capture all of the comments and questions regarding this presentation and can get answers to you, if not in this moment, then certainly in the coming days. So
oh yeah,
go ahead.
I'll put my email address in the chat too.
Okay.
So.
And so if there are questions, please raise your hand and we will take a few now. And I just want to thank Anna and Joseph again for presenting this proposal for stormwater management at Greenwood Cemetery. And I think it's really an incredible model for such a large 500 acres green space in the urban landscape that I'm sure other cities will follow as we start to look at these places within the landscape where there's an opportunity to really lead the way in innovative stormwater management on these types of sites. So thank you both for all of your work in putting this together, and we'll look forward to hearing that you've been awarded your proposed funding. I'm sure you will get it.
And thank you very much for the meaningful letter of endorsement for this. It was sort of
our pleasure.
Proof positive that we felt like we were going in the right direction by having SWIM's backing. So thank you.
Certainly, certainly. So I do have a question about the basins that you're referring to, and wonder if they are they planted areas like the rain gardens that we see in the public right of way with trees and shrubs and plants?
Yeah, that I mean, the aesthetic, I think, is something that Joe may be able to talk more to, especially the particulars of the plants. I think the aesthetic would seemingly be, yes, what is existing in the public right of way. And because they're sort of adjacent to roadways, it might be sort of smaller shrubs and plants as opposed to larger trees, which you would see a little bit further up the slopes. But you know, those are all things that will be designed later on in the design phase.
Yes, yes. And the idea of engaging the public and doing the green jobs training is exactly where we want to be in New York City right now, in this dialogue around ways that we can manage stormwater, which is the root cause of many, many complications in our infrastructure throughout the city. And so that is something that I also commend Greenwood Cemetery on already, with your programs that are already underway in this regard. It's truly a model, and everyone, please make sure that you get out there and see this urban miracle is what I call it. I used to live near there too. I have to say, I had the privilege of spending a lot of time there. It brought me a lot of solace throughout the pandemic, but it's truly an amazing scenario there. And thank you for the thoughtful consideration that you're giving to its role in the landscape.
Absolutely.
So if there are no further questions at this moment on this presentation, I think we will move now to
Could I just ask a slightly off-topic question?
Sure.
It will
Please.
take a few seconds. It's not about stormwater, but it's about cemetery. I had an opportunity to visit a cemetery in Inner Queens last week, and I was amazed to see small lizards all over the place. And I had never seen any lizards anywhere in New York City. And I'm wondering if there's something about, has anybody noticed lizards living in your cemetery?
So we found a relic population of redback salamanders here, and then we began.
Salamanders, lizards.
Right, so there are Italian rock lizards that we see all the time in cemeteries. They are sort of a ubiquitous sighting here.
Italian rock lizards, because I mean, they were quite small, generally like maybe 3 inches, 4 inches from to the end of the tail. And
I
I
don't know
was just so surprised.
Yeah, I think.
I've been in parks all over and never seen a lizard in New York City.
Pardon me, it's an Italian wall lizard, not rock lizard.
Okay.
And it likes rocky areas, which are provided in cemeteries.
Right.
So they are a non-native visitor.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Back
Greenwood,
to water now.
Greenwood also has a population of parrots. If you're not familiar with the green parrots out there that live in the spires of the Greenwood Cemetery entranceway, it is quite a phenomenon to see also.
They are our resident squawkers, indeed.
Indeed. Thank you, Judith. So I think now we'll move to the team from the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency and Department of Environmental Protection to talk with them about the city's Stormwater Resiliency Plan, which Anna has posted a link to in the chat. And I'll turn it over to Alan Cohen, I believe, who will introduce the conversation today, and to welcome both Alan and Erica.
Great, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And I'll actually turn it over first though to Erica Jozwiak from Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. We worked very closely with her office in developing the materials we'll be presenting today. So Erica.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Alan, and thanks for having us today at your meeting. I have never seen a lizard in a cemetery, but now I definitely want to. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. I'm going to share my screen here. Let me know if you can see.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so thanks again for having us. My name is Erica Joswick. I work as a program manager in the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency and Climate Sustainability. I'm here today to discuss the New York City Stormwater Resiliency Plan and some updates on that plan, as was alluded to today, that have come out at the end of September in the new normal report that was post-IDA. So it's a very dynamic time in stormwater management in the city. We will go through the process of developing this plan and get into some of the details on the New York City stormwater maps. And then we'll talk about next steps and implementation.
Thank you.
So to give a little bit of background and context, we know in New York City that extreme precipitation is not the only threat that we're facing from a changing climate. We are preparing for the impacts of increasing intensity of coastal storms, higher sea levels, increased temperature, and this increasing precipitation and the increasing intensity of precipitation in the city is the focus of the presentation today, but we want to make sure that we're always putting this into context of a multi-hazard analysis, that these climate threats that we're going to experience can interact with one another in different ways. And although we do our best to model the impacts of one hazard specifically, all of these changes are going to kind of build on one another. So we definitely have our work cut out for us and the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, and we've been really lucky and happy to partner with DP so closely over the past several years to really better our understanding of how increasing precipitation, the increasing severity of rainstorms is going to impact the city. This is building on a history of work of making these climate hazards accessible to the public and downscaling our climate projections. So for sea level rise and coastal storms, we have the New York City Flood Hazard Mapper. This is a hazard that has a lot more data available and is a little bit more understood in terms of coastal flooding. These types of floods are a little bit more predictable, and we have better projections of hurricanes, and just it's a more predictable hazard overall. For extreme heat, we've also developed the Heat Vulnerability Index, which identifies areas of the city that are most vulnerable to the impacts of increasing heat. And so extreme rainfall is really this next climate hazard that we are, again, developing downscale projections for and then making publicly available maps of the risk. There's challenges about precipitation that are intrinsic to this hazard that make it difficult to downscale these projections. Predicting rainfall is much more dynamic than something like a coastal storm. It could arrive with far less warning than something like an approaching hurricane. It also can have a very different geographic impact. I think we saw that even in the 3 significant storms that we had this summer of Elsa, Henri, and Ida. All of those had a very different geographic impact. If you were in Upper Manhattan, then you may have experienced an entirely different rainstorm than if you were in Southern Brooklyn. And the predictions of where those impacts will come are often with much less advance warning, just by the nature of what this type of climate event is. So this is our kind of first foray into making these maps public. It took a very significant modeling effort over the course of the next couple of years, or the past couple of years. And we have a lot more to do, but this was a really novel effort for the city. And we're excited to kind of advance into this next phase of sharing this research and information and risk exposure to the public. And this is building on decades of work that the New York City Department of Environmental Protection has been doing on innovative stormwater management and upgrades to the drainage system, things like the Green Infrastructure Program, investing in nature-based solutions, and managing cloudbursts, managing stormwater through cloudburst design and the cloudburst pilot program are all things that have been in the works in the past several years. And this plan and the maps build on this existing work. As with any of these extreme weather events, there are always going to be engineering limitations to the protections that we can install, but it's really this legacy of advancing stormwater management practice and adding in new information as we receive it from the scientists that keeps us pushing this program forward and taking steps to protect New Yorkers. As I'm sure everyone in this group is familiar, we also had a really recent example of the importance of stormwater management and understanding the risk to increasing precipitation in the city with Hurricane Ida. On September 1st, we really saw firsthand the damages that can be associated with an extreme rainstorm, shattering many of the records that we had for extreme rainfall at several weather stations, and of course, extremely tragically taking the lives of 13 New Yorkers, many of them who were living in basement apartments. It's so with this backdrop, we have taken another look at our stormwater management plan that we've recently put out and have accelerated many of the initiatives therein. So we'll get into some of the immediate next steps that we have and then kind of our long-term strategy later in this report. But it's with all of this context that we kind of wanted to give a little bit more background on the development of the plan itself. This started in 2018 and involved 2 different rounds of hydraulic and hydrologic modeling with a whole suite of academic partners as well, to understand how stormwater will move throughout the city in different events and how the sewer system will also respond. The final products that were published from this were a publicly available map of several different stormwater scenarios and the stormwater resiliency plan that were released in May of 2020 this year. Sorry, 2021, October, and I still can't get the year right. But what we found in this report is that a better understanding of how precipitation events are intensifying, that we're seeing flooding in areas that maybe have never flooded before, including inland areas that are away from the coast. And coming back to that idea that the precipitation events are very challenging to predict and can occur very suddenly, but that we need to be preparing ourselves for those types of events to the best of our ability. Since that was published, we had experienced Hurricane Ida on September 1st. This really encouraged us to take another look at our commitments in that stormwater resiliency plan. The mayor announced a task force to review the ways that the city was managing stormwater. And at the end of September of this year, the city published this new normal report, which is commitments in 6 different categories to address a wide variety of stormwater related, both emergency responses and long-term planning. And this is in categories of infrastructure and building improvements, outreach to residences and businesses, and also improving our understanding through science and data collection. A real cornerstone of the stormwater resiliency plan process were the release of New York City's first stormwater flood maps. And to get into some of the detail of these maps, I'm going to pass to my colleague, Alan Cohen.
Thanks, Erica. If you go to the next slide, please. First off, I want to start by acknowledging Melissa Enoch, who's not on the call right now, but really spearheaded the second phase of this project, which culminated in the maps that I'm going to discuss now. And so, we set out, as Erica mentioned, in 2018 to develop for the first time maps that reflected not just the coastal flood risk, but the inland flood risk. This is not something that a lot of cities have done. It's not something that's typically reflected in FEMA maps. So we were trying to get out ahead of this issue to show what would happen in an event in an extreme rain event. And we hadn't really experienced anything, as you all probably well know, at the magnitude of Hurricane Ida. So this was not something that was necessarily, well understood or sort of well communicated as a risk at the time. And so Again, these are extreme rain events. They show moderate and extreme flood scenarios coupled with sea level rise. Sea level rise is important to include because it affects the hydraulics of the system, making it harder for water to flow out of our sewer network and creating more flooding during rain events. If you go to the next slide, please. So the key messages of the maps are that all maps show a range of future extreme rainfall scenarios to show how flood patterns might change. They're based on a simplified assumption that extreme rain would occur uniformly across the whole city. So even as we saw with Ida, the intensity of these rain events are almost never, I think it's probably safe to say never, geographically distributed the same throughout the city. But in order for us to look at the risk equally across the city, we assumed that it was. It shows that flooding is mostly concentrated in areas that are low lying or have little green space to soak up excess rainfall, and sometimes overlap with areas that are risk from coastal flooding, but not always. There's clearly a lot of inland flood risk that we previously had not well understood. Next slide, please. So there's two scenarios. The first scenario, what we call the moderate stormwater flood, reflects roughly 2 inches of rain falling in 1 hour. For reference, Ida was about 3 inches of rain in an hour. And that's coupled with 2.5 feet of sea level rise. So the hydraulic impacts from sea level rise are also included in the maps. And that's a high estimate for the 2050s. The rain event, that 2 inches in an hour, reflects a storm that has approximately 10% chance of occurring in any given year today. It shows areas that can't drain if sea level rise blocks storm drains and outfalls, as I already mentioned. And we anticipate, I think we know a lot more about the impacts of these events after Ida. But this is, again, a smaller event than Ida, so it would temporarily disrupt transportation and enter buildings and basements with damage to those properties. Next slide, please. The other scenario, what we call the extreme stormwater flood, reflects a little over 3.5 inches of rain falling in 1 hour. So this is getting closer to and Erica, please correct me if I'm wrong, but this is getting closer to what we did see recently. And it also includes 4.8 feet of sea level rise, which is a high estimate for the 2080s. So this is certainly a very high scenario of rainfall, citywide rainfall, reflecting a storm that has approximately 1% chance of occurrence in any given year. And again, shows areas that can't drain if sea level rise blocks the storm drains and outfalls. So flooding from a storm like this would clearly cause widespread damage and disruption and disrupt transportation networks, along with the flooding that we'd see across coastal neighborhoods from the sea level rise impacts. Next slide, please. So the maps are publicly available. I think we can share a link. Erica, when I turn it over to you in a second, I will copy and paste the link to the maps directly into the chat here. I don't think it's there yet. Again, it reflects both the moderate and the extreme stormwater floods that I just described. Next slide. And so over the coming years, we'll be continuing to improve upon these maps. There was a lot of work, that I won't go into, and I would defer to my colleague Melissa to build out the models, the existing models, to add additional resolution. That's work that's going to continue over the coming years. Along with additional steps to actually validate the the modeling. We don't have a lot of ground truth data aside from 311 in terms of what is actually happening in these events. So we'll be working with the mayor's office and others on efforts to expand monitoring surface level sensors along with our in-sewer monitoring. Next slide. And with that, turn it back to Erica.
Thanks. How are we doing on time? Are we okay, Julie?
Yes, you're good.
Okay,
You-
thanks.
This is, if we take the rest of the meeting for us to have the discussion around this, that's totally fine.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you. I was like, I figured when we started.
It's okay.
So with that context of the maps and the plan, the context for the development of it and the development of the maps themselves, we'll talk about some of the goals that are outlined in for the next steps. So the Stormwater Resiliency Plan defines the commitments for improvements in emergency response of flash flooding and long-term stormwater management through 4 different goals. We'll walk through the plans that we're committed to as of May of 2021 in this presentation in the Stormwater Resiliency Plan. And the intention of this is to have very broad strokes of how we are improving stormwater management in New York City. And so you'll see initiatives in each of these goals that support, again, the flash flood response, improvements in the process and in the identification of areas that are most at risk to flooding. And you'll also see policy directions on how we might advance more innovative solutions in the future. Finally, we'll also turn to goals around the drainage system itself and how we can prepare our legacy infrastructure for a changing climate. So our first goal is also around communication of this risk. So we are releasing these initial maps to the public. These are currently, as we're referring to them, as a beta version, but we wanted to get them out to the public for use as quickly as possible, and we'll continue to refine those. Conducting different stakeholder engagement strategies, and in the longer term, building maps into an interactive online platform that does consider this multi-hazard analysis. So as we talked about in the beginning, this is a risk within a suite of hazards that we know are facing the city. Layering on just like GIS layers and a map doesn't really speak to the interaction of all of these hazards together. So one longer term initiative that we have is to build an online platform that will show the impacts of rain, coastal storms, and sea level rise and the compounding factors. Our second goal is on that emergency response. So updating the areas that we have identified as particularly in need of pre-storm mitigation efforts. So the city will deploy certain resources to like clean catch basins before a storm. We want to make sure that we are aligning those with not only the on-the-ground operational experience, but with this new map of future risk to make sure that we're deploying crews correctly. Alignment of different flood operation procedures between the New York City Emergency Management and DEP, making sure that we know where our key commodity points are and that we have them protected for this hazard, as well as things like coastal storms. Developing notifications for basement dwellings and modeling additional storm scenarios. Our third goal is around policy. So this speaks to additional development of rainfall intensity projections in partnership with the New York City Panel on Climate Change for future years, facilitating green roof deployment in priority areas, updating the on-site stormwater management requirements to reduce the amount of water entering the sewer system, and incorporating stormwater flood mitigation into the New York City Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines, which is a guidance document that incorporates future climate standards into city capital projects. Finally, looking to more our long-term goals, conducting additional modeling to identify the most effective types of interventions in different areas for stormwater flood mitigation, analyzing water and wastewater rate structure options, establish different ways that we would tier neighborhoods in terms of their vulnerability, to understand where we should start implementation of some of these solutions and where the most opportunity is, in terms of subsurface condition or drainage capacity, et cetera. Evaluate and implement these strategies for implementation, and then incorporate the lessons learned into long-term drainage planning. So going through a lot of these relatively quickly, these all in the Stormwater Resiliency Plan that we released in May had associated timelines that ranged from immediate implementation to a 10-year time period. But before we answer questions about these, I do want to put it in the context of this new report, because the new normal report incentivize the city to accelerate many of these efforts. And I think the 6 categories here that we see and that reflected in the report really speak to those same categories that we looked at in the Stormwater Resiliency Plan of improving our emergency response, the communication, notifications, improving our understanding of this hazard through improvements in data collection, monitoring initiatives, flood sensing, et cetera, household and renter homeowner support, and then our long-term infrastructure improvements, working with DEP and other city partners, as well as advocacy at the state and federal level for different initiatives that we know that will help us at the local. So this, I think, is really this new normal report really has pushed a lot of the initiatives forward. There's been so much like cross-city collaboration and this effort that's been pulling together in response to this very tragic event, a really impressive, I think, roadmap for the next steps. And I think we're looking to advance more of our innovative stormwater management solutions that we've already been building on. So a lot of this work has been continuing over the past several years. We're really poised to be able to accelerate some of the work that's been done. And one of those types of innovative stormwater management solutions, I'm going to pass back to Alan to kind of speak more to a case study example.
Thanks, Erica. I'll keep this quick since we've already gone through a lot of content, and some of you may already be familiar with some of the information that I'm about to present. If you can go to the next slide, please. So, one of the things that we've come to understand is that the sewer system, functions to a certain design storm and continues to function thereafter. However, it's surcharged. And so we have water in streets, in open areas, wherever it can go. And we could look to, in the future, how we manage water in traffic areas and open space. It's going to flood. And so if we can look to where we can store it temporarily in places where it might divert it from areas where it could otherwise cause damage, then we can perhaps look to mitigate some of the impacts of these extreme events. There will always be a more extreme event potential, no matter what you design to in a lot of cases. So of course, everything that we do has to be a portfolio of approaches, including protection of at-risk property and infrastructure. Next slide, please. So as some of you may know, we've taken our cues from cities that have already experienced these types of extreme events. In 2011, Copenhagen had what they call a cloudburst event, which was about, I believe, 6 inches of rain in 2 hours. So something comparable to what we saw here for a city that is used to much lower rainfall intensities. They don't get the types of summer thunderstorms, for example, and hurricanes that we do. In response, they developed a cloudburst management plan, a citywide approach to extreme rainfall. And so we saw the benefit in working with Copenhagen. They saw the benefit in working with us as a city that had just experienced in 2012 Hurricane Sandy, a coastal event. So how can we look both to manage, for them, how could they look to manage coastal events that they hadn't yet experienced? And for us, how could we look to manage these extreme rainfall events that at the time we hadn't really experienced? And you can see, these systems are not all that different than some of the rain gardens that we see in New York City. However, there are some key differences in that they are deeper, creating more space for storing rainfall, and they also channel some of the runoff from the existing buildings so that they're diverted, and then streets so that they're diverted into these spaces, less of a passive system than we're used to. Next slide. Some of you may also be familiar with examples from places like Rotterdam. I think this actually predates some of the work in Copenhagen and inspired some of the work in Copenhagen, if I'm not positive about that fact, but the difference that I wanted to highlight here is that it's not always a vegetated space. This is a hardscape surface that's used as a basketball court, and it's a series of detention areas. This is the last place in the series where water will fill up in an extreme rain event. Next slide, please. So using these examples, we set out a couple of years ago as part of the overall effort to improve or mitigate flooding in Southeast Queens. We started working with New York City Housing Authority at the South Jamaica houses to look at what a system like this would look like in New York City. And it was not, a matter of necessarily reinventing the wheel. We have a sense of what works through our green infrastructure program. We have the relationships with NYCHA and others, but we wanted to create a series of practices that were interconnected for these more extreme rain events. In this case, we settled on a 10-year rain event. Again, that's just over 2 inches in an hour, and looked to the existing green space and open space on the property. Next slide, please. So in this process, we also work very closely with the community. This is a more involved process in terms of the changes to the landscape than the typical green infrastructure. We're transforming some of the spaces so that they would temporarily flood. So we wanted to make sure that it reflected the interests of the community. And if you go to the next slide, you can see one of the examples where we were working with residents to understand whether this idea of actually having a space that would temporarily fill up with water was acceptable. And we asked the residents to use blue dots for the alternatives that they liked and red dots for the ones they didn't. And you can see that they chose the alternative that showed the sunken basketball court, taking our cues from Rotterdam. There's still underground storage, so that fills up first, and only in the most extreme events would the court itself fill with water. Next slide, please. And so this is what it would look like on a dry day. This is most of the time. 2 of the areas are essentially just grassy areas that are being depressed into the ground, and the basketball court is the last area in the series of practices. Next slide shows what it looks like in an extreme rain event. And again, the grassy areas would be the first ones to fill up. Then finally, the underground storage in the basketball court, and only in the most extreme rain events would the basketball court itself fill up with water. And I think this is also shown on the next slide, where it demonstrates the interconnectivity of these practices, including the ways that we're actively diverting on-site drainage through from left to right to these areas. Finally, I think there's just a few more slides here. This is just a zoom in of the basketball court, or what we anticipate it will look like, although we're still working with the residents on some of the design features and anticipate finalizing design in the next few weeks or months. And then next slide shows one other example. We used the precedent set by South Jamaica Houses, working with NYCHA and the Mayor's Office. We actually applied for and received FEMA funding for a feasibility study at the Clinton Houses in East Harlem. And this was a project that was identified in an area that could be at risk from extreme rainfall events. So the next slide shows simply that, now we have the advantage of these maps. Before, we did not have a sense of where we had these risks. And so we can look to the maps and the opportunities in the area to temporarily store stormwater in some of the areas like we did at South Jamaica Houses. And I think this is the last slide. So with that, I think we will open it up to question.
Thank you very much to both of you for coming to talk with us today and give us a good overview of where we're headed over the next few years on some of these accelerated plans and over the next few decades to prepare for what we know lies just ahead. And it was the beginning of a conversation, obviously, that has certainly been underway in the form of a productive dialogue with SWIM and all of the agencies throughout the city and state on these topics, and that will continue certainly in the years ahead. And it was an interesting opportunity here in this meeting to kind of zoom in and look at, a specific 500-acre site in the urban landscape in the form of Greenwood Cemetery, and then zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture with the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency and DEP and what their tasks are in the years that lie ahead. And so we're excited to be a part of this dialogue and to be a partner in these discussions and bring all the stakeholders together to continue sharing our knowledge with one another and working together to move these initiatives forward. And so I thank all of you who were here today to present your projects to us, and we'll look forward to continued and productive dialogue around these topics in the years ahead. So I'll open the floor now for some questions, and know that this will be an ongoing dialogue and that we'll come back together many times in the years ahead to talk about these together. But I think we're really at a place where a meaningful dialogue is taking place, and stakeholders are at the table with voices from every neighborhood and from every area of expertise now to solve some of these problems that we face in the years ahead. And I know that we have a good team on the case. So thanks, everyone. It looks like Mike DeLong has a question for us. And Mike, I'll give you the floor. Thank you, from Riverkeeper.
Thanks, Julie, and thank you, Alan and Erica, for coming and presenting before us. And these maps, there's such a huge step forward in resiliency planning for New York. So thank you for all your work on these and on plans. SWIM basically exists because of the limitations on DEP and financial, political will, all of those. And to wit, these plans exist, I think, because of a law that was passed by the City Council through the Environmental Protection Committee, and thanks to Costa and all the work he's done to push these forward. And now when we get these, and we get these plans put in place that are mandates from City Council, they are so helpful to have these things, to plan for the future, and we see what the benefit is. So thanks for putting these together. And these are going to be a great help in planning to prevent this from happening again. I have two questions. The first is, why is Rikers Island, it doesn't seem to be mapped in terms of flooding, and it's so crucial that it does get mapped. Partly because it's one hopeful solution to some of the stormwater problem in New York City. Through renewable Rikers, through creating a new wastewater treatment plant there. But there's also, I think, roughly 4,000 incarcerated individuals living there, unfortunately. And I think it's worth seeing what the risk is to those buildings, to those people, even in the near term. So I wonder why that's not mapped. And my second question is totally different. So do you have any response to that?
I think the short answer is that the areas that were not mapped were areas where we didn't have any information. And Erica, please feel free to chime in here. This is an area where, again, I'd defer to my colleague Melissa for the probably most detailed technical answer, but we didn't have the resolution, any information or the resolution that we needed for the existing drainage network. And so you'll see that's also the case in places like parks. It's been a process for us using existing models like the long-term control plan models to get those to a level where we had additional resolution about the sewer network to resolve flooding citywide and some of these areas. I can't speak specifically to Rikers why that's not available, but we just didn't have the information to be able to run the models.
As the city moves forward with a feasibility plan for wastewater treatment and renewable energy on the island, I think that would have to be a major part of that study. If it's going to be just a flooded out island in 50 years, then maybe it's not so feasible. My second question is on page 53 of the report. It states that you're going to update LTCPs to incorporate climate change projections, which is something that it explicitly does not do. And so I wonder how that is going to work, if there's any enforcement mechanism for any of this, or if you're just going to leave it to the next mayor to decide whether to follow through on that bullet point.
Erica, I don't know if you want to start on this one. Otherwise, I can take a step.
Go ahead, Alan.
Okay. No, I think, I don't think there is, I don't have the details at this point to be able to, describe the, process by which that will happen. I think that could be perhaps some topic for a follow-up discussion where I bring in some of my colleagues from the LTCP process. I'm not aware of any enforcement mechanism to be able to do that. What I will say, is that if I can kind of put in my own 2 cents here, the LTCP process does not, from what I'm aware of, look at mitigating the impacts of flooding. So I think that in the future we need to be careful to look at ways to maximize our investments in infrastructure that can help mitigate these extreme rain events from a flooding perspective, as well as the investments that we're making to reduce water quality. And so I hope that the direction, in the future is that, we move more towards, I'm going to make a plug for our One Water approach. Some of you might have been on the webinar a few weeks ago, a more One Water approach. So we are looking to maximize every dollar invested in green infrastructure, in gray infrastructure, to maximize the benefits for reaching multiple objectives.
Well, thanks, Alan. I look forward to those further conversations, and I totally agree with you. And so glad to hear you saying that. And thanks to you and Erica and everybody else for putting the work into these maps and these reports.
All right, thank you. We've got some hands up, and the order that we'll go in next is Shino, then Judith, and then Leonel. And so Shino, I'll turn the floor over to you for your question.
Thank you. I have two. One is a request and one is a question. So I'll start with the request. Would it be possible on the map to identify NYCHA properties? That would actually make our work a little bit more contextualized in terms of where we might want to focus on our advocacy work. So hopefully you can do that for us. And the question is the cloudburst. I'm actually really excited to see the South Jamaica Houses project with the floodable basketball courts. I've always been very curious about how Rotterdam did that kind of stuff. Do you have a sense of or an estimate of how long that water will take to infiltrate into the ground or drain into the system? This is one of the concerns I hear from residents all the time when we construct these systems is mosquitoes, especially in the summertime. So I'm just curious if you've done that analysis.
Sure. I think with the NYCHA properties, just to address that question, I think that is one of the next steps. Not necessarily, I think we can take back that recommendation in terms of presenting the overlay, but in looking citywide at where there's risks and where there's opportunities for cloudburst management, we'll be looking to NYCHA and other properties. But we'll I think we can consider how we represent specific city-owned properties and others on the maps. With the question about the cloudburst project of South Jamaica Houses, we're following standard green infrastructure program established guidelines and practices. So while I don't have an exact number for you, in terms of how long the water will be stored, it's no longer than I believe 24 or 48. I always get confused on what the guidelines are.
I think it's 48.
48, yeah. And so I think some of the indications are that the soil here is actually very porous and sandy and will likely drain down very quickly. We also have a connection back into the sewer system, so that when, assuming that the sewer system is at capacity, but then when the sewer system has capacity again, the core can drain back into it.
Thank you.
Sure.
And next we have Judith Weiss with a question.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to see all the work you're doing with the inland neighborhoods that are low-lying. I was wondering about the coastal neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Staten Island and so forth. How about them? And a second question is the Department of City Planning involved in any of this? Because I was on an advisory committee for the waterfront management plan, and they did not seem to be really facing up to this with the seriousness that it needs. And that's through the Department of City Planning.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So for your first question, definitely coastal areas are still under consideration and will receive investment under some of the goals that we have here. I think the intention of calling out the inland areas specifically were that we observed especially during Ida, areas flood inland that maybe have never flooded before or like had more serious impacts than had been previously predicted. So that was the focus of like highlighting inland areas specifically, is that it's just a much wider geographic area, but it's not to say that we are eschewing coastal areas in any of our investments either. So just want to reassure on that. Because we know that many of those areas are at highest risk for not only this hazard, but for coastal hazards and sea level rise. Yes, Department of City Planning has been involved in this process, and we've also been involved in the comprehensive waterfront plan in their development. We have been in communication with them, especially post Ida, on making sure that the narrative around stormwater management is strong. And there is a section of that plan, which I'm sure that you're familiar with if you've been sitting in on those, that's about water quality targets. That does focus only on the coastal areas. So with this precipitation-based risk, because it is both coastal and inland areas, many of I think the language in that report is really focused on coastal storms, but we did go back through that report post Ida and make sure that the language is more broad than just hurricane related flooding or tidal flooding, and making sure that we're considering the risk from precipitation flooding in those areas as well. So it's a great flag. I think, you know, we're on the same page, and Department of City Planning has also been a really important partner in this.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Leonel, and then after Leonel, Jody Colon. So Leonel.
Also two parts, sorry about that. The first one is a broader question about participation by advocates and stewards. I know, Julie, that there are some conversations and everyone here happening, but in terms of public meetings and comments on these accelerated and amended plans, as well as maybe even participation in monitoring itself, right, and in ground truthing the data. Are there any ideas or dates being set for that or being proposed for the next administration? And then the second question is around the maps themselves. We see many different mapping sites now coming from each department, but if the idea is integrated, hazard and risk management, are these maps with the flood hazard map and now this one being integrated into the broader set of open data and mapping that the city provides, so advocates and citizens can take a look at all these risks overlaid? I have other questions, but they're more specific, so I'll share later.
So to answer I think I'm trying to take notes here. The second one on mapping, the integrated mapping. Yes, there is an intention to consolidate all of this into one platform and one map that will really display the areas of risk and the different hazards. This is a multi-year effort, and it's because there is a need to build an integrated model that's going to consider all of those compounding risks, not only just like one single precipitation or one single coastal risk. We know that it's not the best solution to have many different mapping platforms out there that kind of speak to the different hazards. So it is something that we've established as a goal, and that we are planning for the next several years to release this mapping process on the Stormwater Resiliency Plan. You saw it took 2 years to do this hydraulic and hydrologic modeling. It takes many months just to run a single simulation of just this one type of climate risk. So adding in all of these different multi-hazards and how those interact is a pretty significant computing effort that we just have to take the time to make sure that we get right. So we're releasing information as we get it as quickly as possible, but we know that we need to have this like one integrated platform. I think that your first question was on outreach. There's a couple of things that I just wanted to point out. We're definitely happy that we've been doing briefings on this, the Stormwater Resiliency Plan, with a variety of different groups since the release. One opportunity that has been in the process of teeing up since this engagement started is on the flood sensor network, and how we can start bringing in different groups together to expand our understanding of this risk. There's a website that I can put in the chat as well, is FloodNet. That has a couple of different academic partners that we're currently working with, and we've committed to expanding that network too. So that's definitely one opportunity. And I think we're grateful for the opportunities like this to speak with you all, and happy to do, more specific, presentations or briefings along these lines as well.
Thank you. That would be great. And I think, this is where SWIM has excelled over the years in receiving these reports, reviewing them, and sharing out the results and monitoring them over time and providing comments and input. And I think Lionel raises the bar here for us to even do better than that, and to really ensure that all stakeholders are at the table. Boots on the ground are the ground truth, and that really is the data that we need to work with going forward. And we're certainly happy to be a place where we convene to have these conversations going forward. And I think there are opportunities through all of the SWIM Coalition members who convene symposia and seminars and webinars. And so we'll look forward to continuing to bring that forward to the public discourse in a meaningful way, and appreciate so much you taking the time to be with us here today, certainly. And I think there will be an opportunity for us to all come together on many occasions going forward. And so I think we have a question now from Jody Colon.
Hi, thanks, Julie. Thanks for those great presentations. I'm with the Friends of Spite and Dival in the Bronx, and I'm excited to see about inland flooding is being looked at. So Julie, you gave me the perfect segue, because my question is about ground truthing. We've had apartment building lobbies flood due to DOT concrete added and curb lines changed that don't drain into the storm basins. We've had, the Spite and Dival Metro North station flooded because we're on the ridge. So how can community groups like myself who do advocacy help collect some of this ground truth information? Van Cortlandt Park Lake overflowed. I want to get in touch with the Greenwood people. I'm like, we could do that in the Bronx. They had vehicles damaged from the flooding. So there's this really disconnect between what the city agencies are knowing and doing. So is there a way that community groups can help get this information and connect the dots through some of the agencies? That's a big question, sorry.
It's an important one.
Anybody care to tackle it for me?
Yeah, definitely a large question. I think in the immediate kind of post Ida efforts is we still are looking for information about the flood depths and the time of those depths were experienced, and if there's any imagery related to those. This is, I don't think, answering your larger question, but in this one immediate need where we are actively hoping to understand where we saw different impacts. If there's information that your group has and would want to share on the depth, the time, and any imagery of the flooding that was experienced in a certain area with very specific geographic locations, I think it would also help us to build out our the kind of understanding of the impacts of the event. We're soliciting this from a variety of different data sources, and we're working with New York City Emergency Management as well. Because this was such a large geographic impact, and we don't have the same type of for an example of a coastal storm, we have tide sensors that we have installed in certain areas, and that gives us a lot of meaningful information. We're replicating that type of data collection for precipitation-based flooding, but we're also hoping to augment that with things like social media impacts or words from our community partners, that we can say okay, maybe we didn't have a sensor in this exact location. Here's what information we have right now, and maybe we have a sensor there in the future, so that we can understand and really get solid data on a variety of different precipitation-based events. So if that's something that you'd be willing to share, certainly I think you could send Alan and I an email, or if we want to discuss more directly on that. It's something that we're still, I think, trying to conceptualize for like what it means with a broader process.
That actually sounds great. I'll put my email in the chat. I actually was the team chief of our community emergency response team, trained by OEM and deployed during Irene and Sandy.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I had implemented that never got rolled out citywide was having those teams go out and clear storm drains. So we did that in Community Board 8. We would deploy pre-storm and clear some of the drains. So definitely this is, I recently retired, so I'm coming back to my first love, stormwater, not composting. So definitely I'll put my email in the chat, and anybody that wants to know what's going on in the Bronx, I'm happy to have a convo with you. Thanks so much.
And
Thanks,
there's
Jody. Thank you for your
also,
work.
yes, thank you, Jody. There's also an opportunity coming up next week on October 20th at a city council public hearing on the oversight of green infrastructure, CSO management, and urban flooding, which will be held by the Committee for Environmental Protection and Coastal Resilience in collaboration with New York City Parks Department. And I have a link which we can put in the chat for accessing that hearing if you want to sit in on it. And we can also provide information to you if you would like to testify at that hearing. It is October 20th at, I believe, 1 o'clock. We'll confirm that with everybody, but that's an opportunity for our voices to be heard and go on the record with our thoughts on these matters. And I think the city council committees will continue to provide opportunities where we can get our voices heard on these topics. And I believe I have provided you with one link, which is to where one can view the hearing when it takes place next week, but we should also provide information about how to testify. So I'll follow up on that. And I encourage everyone to make the time for these virtual hearings when you can to get your information on the public record, which SWIM will help facilitate going forward. So be sure that you're signed up for our e-blasts, and we'll continue to update folks on opportunities to get our voices heard. So I believe that is all of the hands that were up when I last checked in terms of questions. So I think we have a little bit of time in which I'll just run through a few of the items that SWIM's working on now and going forward. And then we'll do lots of follow-up post-meeting. But I want to open the floor right now to some of our members who are here with us today, working on specific initiatives. And Karen Imans, if you're still here from the Waterfront Alliance, I know that the Rise to Resilience Coalition has been working hard on some policy in the form of Intro 1620. And we'd love to get an update from you on that legislation if you are still with us. I'm checking.
Yes. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Karen.
And nice to see you. Thanks for everything and putting this meeting together today. And great to see some folks on here. I did want to just provide a quick update on Intro 1620, which passed the City Council last week. This is a bill that adopts a 5-borough climate adaptation planning process for New York City. This is actually an interesting piece of legislation that was introduced almost 2 years prior, first in the form of a plan that was going to strictly look at shoreline infrastructure. At the time, the Rise to Resilience Coalition, which has been looking at legislation and regulatory efforts to improve policies and funding for adaptation, climate adaptation, resilient infrastructure, for green infrastructure. We looked at that shoreline infrastructure bill and, sort of said it's a good start, but it's certainly not covering enough ground. And what happened over time, and actually really, I think spurred by Ida, was an attempt to amend and revisit the legislation, and the Rise to Resilience Coalition was able to meet with electeds and city agencies, and I think come up with a much more comprehensive and robust bill that looks at a couple of different things. Multiple climate hazards is an important piece of it. Also a prioritization exercise where communities that are experiencing those climate hazards and risks most front and center, coupled with social vulnerabilities, environmental justice issues, will receive prioritization in some of the adaptation planning that will come out of that legislation. So that's, I think, a real win in terms of how the city is looking to wrestle with this. I think an important thing to note is ultimately this bill is the beginning of a process, certainly not the end of the process. It's going to be a plan every 10 years that sets short, middle, and long-term goals and different adaptation strategies, again, targeted towards neighborhoods in some sort of prioritization exercise. There are things that, while we're celebrating the passage now, we're certainly going to be looking at as implementation begins, how the plan is sort of undertaken, especially by a new administration that's going to effectively adopt this, that the Mayor's Office of Climate Resilience, which will probably be the lead agency on this, is well equipped, well staffed, funded to carry out the plan, that there's extensive community engagement involved with this plan, because obviously if there are going to be strategies proposed for certain communities, that the community has an opportunity to weigh in on that process. So I think there's going to be a lot of work to be done kind of moving forward. So we're really pleased to see that the plan has in fact been passed. The city has not had this kind of 5-borough climate adaptation plan, although pieces of it may live in different places, like the comprehensive waterfront plan or the stormwater plan that was recently released, but this is strictly focused on adaptation planning. So I think a really great outcome. We're grateful to many of the groups on this call that were part of the effort to get this passed, but also going to be watching very closely, speaking with the new mayoral office about how implementation is actually going to begin. And I'll just add one quick thing, and we're looking also at the hearing next week, Julie, that you just mentioned, and just getting familiarized with some of the legislation. But I think it's great to see that there are efforts being made that are sort of, in different timelines on the trajectory, because obviously this 5-borough climate adaptation plan, this is longer term planning. And there are some things being proposed, for example, at the hearing next week. I just saw something about backwater valves and helping homeowners be able to finance or purchase equipment or retrofit that can be done more immediately and more near term. And I think that's definitely something to recognize in terms of helping equip and empower homeowners, building owners to make fixes today that don't have to wait for 5-10 year planning ranges.
Right. Thank you, Karen. Yeah. That is extremely important to remember, that we have all these timelines, some of which are short term and some of which are long term. And I think that was really a helpful overview of what we have to work with in the way of tools, certainly, and policy is a big part of it. And I think the extreme weather report that followed the publication of the Stormwater Resiliency Plan really reflected a series of short-term and long-term actions that will get underway within the next 3 years and then over time. And I think that's really the best way to approach such a large-scale planning effort. So I commend everyone who's taking that long view and the short view. And I definitely encourage everyone to pay close attention to the meetings of the city council committees on environmental protection and coastal resilience, and to also follow along with SWIM and the Rise to Resilience Coalition and the groups who are leading the discussions around these matters. It's at the forefront now, and we have opportunities to really make meaningful policy and accelerate some of the programs that have been underway on a long-term time horizon to make them happen a little bit more quickly. So that's a positive development out of a not so positive set of circumstances. I also, in reflecting back on some of the questions that came up during our discussion timeframe, remembered that DEP is mapping also at the parcel level in New York City. And Alan, I wonder if you are able to provide an update on when you think that mapping might be available and how it will be integrated into some of these programs and plans that are underway.
That's actually already available. So I can find a link right now and put that into the chat as well. So that is information, that will be available to us too in future modeling efforts.
Great. So this was a lot to take in today, and something that we'll have to take in manageable bites over time to digest and synthesize and come up with some input and comments on the plans and programs that we've talked about today. And, SWIM has focused for a long time on green infrastructure solutions in addition to the gray infrastructure programs that are underway in the city. And green infrastructure is certainly an important tool in the suite of tools that we'll have to deploy at scale over the next 5 to 10 years and get ready for the decades ahead. And in that regard, we follow very closely the city's green infrastructure plan, which is one of the largest programs in the country and has been underway now for quite some time. And again, a lot of credit to Melissa Enoch and the team at DEP for the work there on the green infrastructure plan. And we recently had a stakeholder meeting with them regarding the plan and where it is in terms of its milestones. And the stakeholder group submitted some comments on the proposed contingency plan for catching up with some of the milestones in the green infrastructure plan. That's something that we've been working on recently and will continue to work on. And Mike, I don't know if you want to make any comments on the highlights of some of the questions that we raised regarding the status of the plan at this time. It has, as noted in the resiliency plan, and I believe also in the extreme weather report, been underway with the deployment of rain gardens and infiltration basins in the public right of way to the tune of some 11,000 assets, now capturing and managing some of our stormwater runoff. And we've just put in the chat a link to the city's contingency plan and also a link to the letter that we've submitted to them with some questions. Mike, if you would like to raise any of the questions that we were asking, feel free to do so.
Sure. I mean, I think there are plenty of people on this call that know more about the GI program than I do, but the letter that we sent in, I'll just talk, I guess, about the themes of that letter. First is that we are thankful that DEP and DEC have kept this program running throughout COVID and the pandemic, given the challenges that they've had. DEP hasn't met its mandates under the consent order. It's got a lot of work to do. And we don't think this should only be DEP's burden. We think that DEP should have help from other city agencies to do this. It seems like some of the IDA response is kind of reflecting that this really needs to be an all hands on deck approach. Funding is a concern. A lot of the funds from New York City tend to go upstate, and funding this type of infrastructure is crucial. It's an environmental justice concern. It's a water quality concern. And so some of that money from the state that goes in what they've called the Mother Nature Bond Act. That's what Governor Cuomo called it. I think now we're calling it just the Bond Act or the Environmental Bond Act. Some of that money should come down to the city. There are a few environmental justice concerns as DEP is moving some of its assets in the right of way to a more, I'd call it a less green practice. It's a stormwater capture basin, which is almost a concrete cap that allows stormwater infiltration. Those are good practices, but they don't offer the same types of green co-benefits that the vegetated practices offer. So we do want to make sure that that all of the communities in New York are being treated equally, getting equal access to those green practices. Maintenance is a big concern. Obviously, with 10,000 assets, that is an enormous maintenance burden. So that has to be dealt with. There are potential major great opportunities here to do job training and have local jobs that are well paying, I guess, called green collar jobs in New York City. So we're asking how that plan can be moved forward. And right back to the how do we get other agencies involved? How do we get DOT involved and parks to be more of a partner rather than somebody who's under the, just trying to comply with the consent order, as opposed to every project that gets done in the city should have stormwater capture as a piece of that project. So there's plenty more to it, and the intent of this is to open up those dialogues about the future of this program and where it turns to now that it's maturing. And right, how do we turn the city into a sponge?
Yeah. And there are some good examples of groups, Gowanus Canal Conservancy and Newtown Creek Alliance, as well as Greenwood Cemetery, who are starting to initiate these citizen maintenance of GI assets, conversations and job trainings. And I think we'll see some opportunities for those to grow. I think Amy is not here today from the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, but
She's here.
Oh, good. Hey, Amy, if you have a minute to talk a little bit about some of the work that you all are doing in this regard, that would be great.
Sure, and it looks like Newtown Creek Alliance is on the
Oh,
line,
good.
so they can chime in. But yeah, essentially we have a grant from New York Community Trust. It's a sort of multi-organization partnership between GCC, Newtown Creek Alliance, Bronx River Alliance, and the HOPE program, all of which have on the ground GI stewardship and maintenance activities that have been ongoing for many, many years. So the idea is to really sort of look at this under one lens and kind of identify strategies, tactics, and ways of moving towards a framework that the city could potentially leverage as they expand GI maintenance activities citywide. And so the grant was funded or kicked off earlier this year. We had an event in Bushwick near some rain gardens, or there was some planting, and we'll be developing next steps over the coming months. But all in all, an exciting opportunity and a great way to sort of look at this citywide with work that's being done on the ground.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. And while we're on this subject of green infrastructure, there are two other items that I want to include in our discussion today. And one is a symposium that is being organized by the Green Roof Researchers Association and the Green Roofs for Healthy Cities. And that is taking place. It is on the several case studies and practice of green roofs in New York City. We have a link going into the chat that you can register for that symposium taking place on October 19th. And Dustin, if you're here and want to make any comments about that symposium, we welcome them. I know he was here earlier.
I think he logged off.
Okay. Well, I think that is one of many opportunities where we can learn more about what's happening and really zoom in on specific projects with green roofs that are here in the city now, and how we can look to those as models for deploying at scale the number of green roofs that we know we have the capacity for in New York City. And there are many incentive programs coming to the fore to help support the installation of, and even policy, green roofs in New York City. And so we're excited to have the opportunity to be in a working group that is informing some recommended expansion of the green roof tax abatement program, which we'll talk more about in our upcoming e-blast and blog posts. And the conversations are underway right now to revise that legislation and have it come before the legislators in vote. And it is a recommendation that is reflected in the City Hall extreme weather report as an action that we can take right away to expand that program in order for folks to install more green roofs with the support they need to do it. And green roofs are a tool in the suite of many that we'll need to deploy over time. And so we're excited to continue the conversation around ways to deploy at scale green roofs in New York City and monitor them and look at their performance and see what in fact they are managing in the way of volume in stormwater. And Shino, if you have any other comments you'd like to make regarding that at this time, please feel free.
I don't, but I just want to point out to everybody that Willis just put in a media coverage of the GI maintenance partnership project. And I don't know if Willis want to add anything to that since you're here. So.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Shino. Yeah, there's not much to add from what Amy said. It's something we've been talking about and groups like GCC have been working on for a while. So we're really excited to have this opportunity to try and formalize more of this partnership with DEP so that small community-based organizations can take on this maintenance work, because we're in the neighborhood, we're seeing what's happening, and we want to be able to have a viable opportunity to officially take care of these assets and engage the community in that process. So really excited to be continuing this work, and DEP has been a great partner to date. So that's really about it.
Thanks, Willis.
And I did think about one thing that I wanted to quickly share. So the Green Roof Tax Abatement Working Group had a quick meeting yesterday, and something that has come up that caught our attention, and it comes from a green roofer who's part of the group. Apparently, a lot of developers who have to comply with the local law 9294, which requires green roof and or solar panels on new construction, they're finding ways to get out of the requirement. So one of the ways they're doing it is claiming that the rooftop is a recreational space and putting in a teeny tiny section of the roof that's a green roof. It's really not doing much in terms of reduction in energy consumption, cooling effects, or stormwater capture, but they're still apparently in compliance with the law by doing that because there is a loophole. There is also other ways that they are skirting the requirement of the law. So it might be something that we need to actually take a closer look at to close that loophole within the local law 9294 in the coming years. Just wanted to throw that out there. So if you know any green roofers who are working in this area, and if you're starting to see that kind of developers not complying authentically, let us know.
Okay. So the topics that we've talked about today are obviously topics that we're going to continue to talk about and delve into in detail over time throughout the remainder of this year and over the next few years, no doubt, and in SWIM public meetings and in other places where we all convene and gather to address these matters. There is an upcoming conference next month that the Harbor and Estuary Program is leading and hosting, and we'll put some information about the conference taking place in November. And Shino, you probably have a little bit more information about it, but one of the panels that I think is really interesting is going to be a group of waterway stewards from around the city who are going to talk about some of the local waterways that are in vulnerable communities and are in need of voices to advocate on their behalf. And some of the swim members will be sitting on that panel. So we're looking forward to the discussion there. And that's always an opportunity for us to get together and talk about solutions at the citywide scale and beyond. So be sure to attend the HEP conference.
I don't think we have a link to share yet. I
Okay.
don't, Rosanna's here too, but I'm going to quickly share the symposium that's going on this week and for the next couple of weeks, which is the Urban Soils Symposium. It's all virtual. There might be a couple in-person workshops, but I'm putting a link in the chat. So please do stop by if you have time. Rosanna,
Okay.
go ahead. Tell us about the HIP conference.
Thanks,
Hi.
Sheena. Thanks, Julie. Hi, guys. Yeah, so right now we just have the save the date for the conference. It'll be the week of the 15th with the Friday off, so just Monday through Thursday. It will be completely virtual. We're going to bring back our favorite platform, Whova, which apparently has some updates. So if you forgot your password from last year, do not worry, you can get that resetted. We will be offering it for free, so I encourage everyone to send it to your networks, particularly any young professionals who are trying to get into this field. I think it'll be a really great session in terms of really thinking about some of our DIJ initiatives and providing trainings during that time. We're also thinking, you know, as Julie, you mentioned, thinking about water stories, both personal and professional, thinking through communications, water quality and risk, right, in interacting with our waterways. There'll be a session that we're working on in terms of retaining youth in the sciences as well. So how do we encourage our youth to be part of our organizations and be leaders in those organizations in the long run? So trying to support that conversation further of that pipeline and pathway. I think we are planning on getting the agenda and more information probably by the end of this week, if not next, is the plan. We really are, the staff is really pushing forward on trying to really make this a well-rounded conference for everyone to participate. So, you know, be on the lookout, check our homepage. We'll end up changing the link on our homepage on our website, on the calendar with the information about the conference as it gets posted on our website. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, everybody. And SWIM will continue to keep everyone informed on several initiatives that we're taking part in, one of which is the city's 3-year water rate study that has a stakeholder advisory committee informing it. And we'll provide some updates after our next stakeholder meeting, which will happen later this month on that, as well as a working group that we've formed in support of our city's Class I and SD waters. We'll be coming out with a fact sheet and some more information about what this working group is planning in order to respond to some actions by the state that appear to be working in opposition of the efforts that have been underway to get these waters to a place where they're clean enough and safe enough for primary recreational contact. And so stand by for more information from our working group in the months ahead. And of course, we'll be monitoring these 2 plans that we've talked about today in detail. And we have a blog post up now, a preliminary one on the 2 reports and some of the main highlights from them and the recommendations that are being made, which we're excited to see coming to the fore like this at this time. And we
Julie,
also,
oh, sorry. I just wanted to make sure that there's one person who called in. And I'm going to ask the person to unmute and just introduce yourself, and wanted to give the floor to the person because it's hard to participate in these meetings when you're just calling in. So the person on the 347 number, would you like to introduce yourself and if you have any questions or comments? Or the person may have stepped away. All right. Sorry, Julie. I just wanted to make
that's
sure. we were
okay.
all- Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Shino. That's pretty much the summation of where we're headed and where we'll be reporting out. We did conduct a survey of swim members on their experiences during and after Ida and what their organizations are undertaking in response to the impacts in their neighborhoods and on their waterways. And we'll have the results of the survey by the next time we convene a public meeting, and certainly on our website and in the blog before that. And then we'll update any changes to the Greenwood. And of course, in the coming year, we'll be meeting with all of the newly elected officials to update them on stormwater infrastructure matters, priorities, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you at the next public meeting, and thank everyone for taking the time today to join us for this conversation, and look forward to continuing with you moving forward. And if there are any last announcements anyone has, if not, then we'll sign off.
Wait, can we all unmute ourselves and give Julie and Anna a huge applause? So 1, 2, 3, unmute and clap.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you both.
Julie. And
My
thank you,
pleasure.
Anna.
Our
Have a
pleasure.
great rest of the week, everyone.
Bye.
Oh, I see Lisa. Hi, Lisa.
Hi. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.